Good morning and welcome to our Reset event. I'm Louise Fisk, the Communications and Marketing Director for BAE Systems Applied Intelligence, and I'm delighted and quite excited to be able to introduce this conference. You can see from your agenda that it's pretty packed with speakers today. Each of our speakers are going to spend some time talking about their area of expertise and really addressing some of the biggest issues in the cyber world today. I think the industry's at quite an inflection point where the pace of technology is so fast now that criminals are really able to take advantage of that. And as we move forward as industry, we're not going to be able to protect our estate on our own anymore. We're going to have to do it together and share information. So I'm particularly excited to hear what people have to say today. It won't have escaped your notice that all of our speakers are female today. This event was conceived by two of our female threat analysts, threat intelligence analysts, with the idea of really moving on from the sort of backward sense of talking to females in the industry about what it's like to be a female in the industry, rather than talking to them about their expertise and what they've spent years researching. So this is very much about the content rather than gender. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping points. So first one being the usual one, which is please either turn your phones off or turn them to silent. We will have a number of breaks today where you can go out and check messages. The second one is that there are no planned fire alarms today. So if you do hear it go off, please just head to the exits and walk slowly and carefully out of the building. However, it is the first anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, so we will be joining other communities at 12 o'clock and holding a 1-minute silence. So the alarm will go off at 12 and will go off again at 1 minute past 12. So without further ado, I would like to hand you over to your hosts today and the ladies who this brainchild is, Saha Naumann and Kirsten Ward.
Thanks, Louise, for the introductions and being so supportive of the whole event.
As we said, we are the organizers of this conference, and we're both threat intelligence analysts at BAE Applied Intelligence. So we'll tell you the full story of Reset in our closing remarks, but for now, we want to jump straight into the great lineup of speakers that we have.
First, we have Mary Haigh, Product Director at BAE Systems Applied Intelligence, where she heads up marketing strategy of cybersecurity products. Mary Haigh will be talking to us about how threats are continually evolving and how defenders need to be doing the same. Not only this, how threat intelligence should be used to its best effect.
It's really great to be here today, and I've spoken in lots of conferences in my career, but I have to say this one is unique, and it's such a privilege to talk today, and it's a great event to be at. I hope you enjoy it. So, cyber immune systems, adaptive defense, it's something that product vendors have talked a fair bit about, particularly endpoint detection and response vendors over the past few years. This idea that we can have a cyber immune system with the products that we put in, and they will self-heal themselves. They will cope with changing environments, and they will give you the protection you need. It's a really appealing concept. We're strapped for resources. We don't have enough people with the right expertise. We've got tight budgets. What better than the idea that you could put in a product or a few products and they would kind of look after themselves and give you the protection that you need no matter what's happening in the changing threat landscape. But as an analogy, it's something I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. It kind of leaves you with the impression that it'll just cope for itself. You can just feed in a few signatures and it'll get going. Or even that the analytics that you build, if you're not relying on a signature-based system, if you've got analytics, that they will somehow be able to learn without any feedback. And that really isn't the reality. That's a little bit of vendor hype, I think, if we're honest. Those systems always need feeding and watering. They always need looking after. They need teaching. Analytics need to learn from what's good and bad. And if you're not feeding in that as a labeled data set and using supervised machine learning, you better be using your analysts to triage all the alerts that are coming out. to get rid of the bad stuff. So I just wanted to dig into that analogy a little bit further and just see how much it holds up and whether we can actually use it to helpfully think about how we do build a really healthy and effective cyber immune system. If you think about the human immune system, actually it needs a fair bit of help to keep it healthy, unless you want to accept kind of 18th century, 19th century mortality rates, which we don't, then you do need a fair bit of help. If you think about the flu virus, mutations happen in that flu virus all the time, and we have significant numbers of medical experts, some of them not too far from here, who are researching diseases and how they're mutating and how the human body copes with it and what vaccinations they can come up with to help us survive those mutations. And that's just things that are going on in the background that we kind of have no control over, those mutations. Then there's things that we choose to do to ourselves. So maybe we're getting a little bit bored with this cyber malarkey. We fancy a bit more excitement and we go off on a trip to the Thai jungles to go trekking for a month. You arrive there and you are exposed to waterborne diseases that you've never seen before. You're exposed to a load of mosquitoes and insects carrying diseases that you've never seen before. You wouldn't dream of doing that trip without going and getting a load of jabs before you went along. So there are environmental factors that you choose to do to yourself, and then there are background factors that just happen that you have to cope with. And actually, it's no different to the cyber world. In the world of human health, we've got it quite nicely mapped out. We've got the vaccination plans mapped out for our children so that they're covered for the major diseases that happen. We've got a global map which shows what vaccinations you need depending on where you're going to and which country. Wouldn't it be great if in the cyberspace we had such clarity over the risks that you're facing and, more to the point, the mitigations that you're going to take? And that actually is a talk in itself about how we look at that and how we can get better as vendors and as an industry as a whole of really getting clarity of the things that we do to ourselves that increase risk and then the mitigations that we're going to take in response to that. So let's look at it from a cyber point of view now. The threat landscape is changing all the time. Attacks are happening all the time and changing how they do it, the different forms of malware. We can feed in threat intelligence feeds into our security devices, IOCs and such like. But if you do them in point isolated solutions, so just feeding in those IOCs, those indicators of compromise into specific devices, without considering it as a whole, you can end up almost hurting yourself. So mutations, if you want to look at it like that, that are hurting your own system. So a classic example would be blocking a legitimate IP address, or performing patches with all the goodwill in the world that then turn out to break your systems, or auto-remediating some malware that's landing on some server, isolating it, and then remembering that was a business-critical server and that you've just stopped X million pounds worth of business coming through into your business, and actually that bit of malware would have done less damage than you isolating the machine. So it's quite possible for us to take that threat intelligence and almost mutate it ourselves, use it in the wrong way to cause our self-damage. And that comes from that very channeled view of just feeding in a piece, if you like, just the IOCs, just those indicators of compromise into one device. Then there's the environmental factors that happen within cyber, so the things that businesses choose to do to themselves, that trip to the jungle. And they're for very good business reasons that we do them, and we absolutely have to, as business, take those extra risks. We just have to look at the way to respond to them. So things like, one at the moment, cloud adoption. Everybody's moving towards cloud. It absolutely makes business sense to do it, but it does change your risk as a result, and it does change how you need to monitor and respond as a result of doing that. Another one will be partnerships. Classic attack route at the moment is through supply chain. So looking at the partnerships you develop and the supply chain you build out and how those impact the risks that you experience and the mitigations you need to take. Acquisitions. You buy another company and you take on all of their nasty networks and policies and people with their behaviours. Shadow IT, the employees who take it upon themselves, take the initiative and just go build it. And you end up with bits of IT that you know nothing about. So all of those things are environmental factors which need to be considered just as much as the threat intelligence feeds that are coming in, and they need to be considered together in order to come up with a good response. So how well do we do at it? How well do we look after our own cyber immune system? The recent Ponemon report said that we kind of get the value of threat intelligence. 77% of people said, yep, threat intelligence is a good thing and we know we should be using it. And yet, only 50% of incident responders use threat data. That's quite a contradiction, actually. So the very people who are going to respond to some of those high priority alerts that come in and clean you up are not looking at the threat intelligence that tells them the overall plan of attacks, what attackers are doing, their modus operandi, their motives. And only 27% of people think that threat intelligence is actually effective for them in finding cyber threats. So there's still quite a lot of work to do there. And the top two reasons given for failure was there's too much data and it's too complex. So there's all this threat intelligence flooding in, and we haven't really worked out how to use it in terms of processes, skill sets, the automations that we've got in place. That whole, it is people, process, and technology around feeding the immune system to keep it healthy. And a big part of that is having the right expertise, which we know is really hard to get hold of. So what symptoms do we see of this immune failure? 32% of respondents said that they had blocked legitimate traffic by misinterpreting the threat intelligence. That can be pretty painful to a business. Again, 32% said they had no holistic view. So they collect the threat intelligence, but they collect it in multiple places and they feed it through to multiple people, and there's no tying together of what it all means, so that you're not having the right expertise, the groups of expertise coming together and looking at that threat intelligence. They're challenged by the workflows associated with threat intelligence collection and analysis, so just even pulling it and understanding it and looking at it, those workflows around it, they find difficult to do. It's not always as timely and as accurate as you want it to be. And a lot of the threat intelligence need work. They need normalizing before you can use them, before you can make use of it. So there's a lot of it. It's tricky to handle, and we handle it in silos, as a summary. So where do we fail in all of this? Really, it's around how to make use of that threat intelligence. It's setting up those processes to operationalize it. In other words, do something about the information that has come in. So understand what it means for us, what it means for our business, making sure that we do sift out the bits that are business relevant to us, and then making it actionable. And it isn't easy. This isn't something that I can go, yeah, you know, some people have got it sorted, look over there. It is really hard. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we say that it can be easy or it can be straightforward. You kind of have to embrace the complexity of it, break it down into manageable pieces, and then work through it and gradually improve. But don't pretend that you can just have these self-healing systems and that it will work itself out for you, because it probably won't. So, these are some thoughts on how we can start to pull this stuff together. Because I didn't want to just set out the problems and then go, there you go. So it is a jigsaw to put it together, and here's some of the pieces that you might want to look at as you start to consider it. So you need to gather together the pieces of the threat intelligence, and it's not just about hash values and IP addresses and domain names. It's a bit bigger than that. It's starting to try and understand the tools that the attackers use. So those IOCs all came out of some research somewhere, someone pulling a bad thing that happened, understanding how it happened and pulling out the indicators of compromise for it so that you can find it again. And if you understand that bigger picture, as with most things in life, if you understand the bigger picture, you tend to make better use of it. So understand the tactics, techniques and procedures that attackers use, and then break it down into the different domain names, IP addresses and hash values that are there and make use of them. You've then got to build a picture of the adversary, the guys that are actually producing this stuff that's attacking you. So understand who they are. Is it organized crime? Is it someone who dislikes the type of industry you're in? Understand what their motives are and what they're trying to do. And understand the infrastructure they've got. Have they got massive networks themselves? Do they borrow somebody else's? Do they have huge teams of developers? So are they highly professionalized with HR departments and engineers, an engineering process, just like we are? Some of those attackers are. What capabilities do they have? What techniques, tactics, and procedures are favored by that attack group? And who are they going after? So you don't need to understand every attack group that's out there, but it would definitely be a good idea to understand the ones that are going to want to target you because of what you do. That helps you put into context the types of attacks that are going to come your way, the more serious ones. And then the third piece is your business. So you've got to map through from the key business risks. So where's your business heading in terms of strategy and vision? What are the business risks associated with that? And how does that translate through into the cyber risks that you will experience? How does that map into the existing defenses if you've got? Are you in a good place? Are you keeping track with the changes that the business is making? And what existing monitoring have you got in place? So you've got your defenses and you're watching what's going on, the two together. When you tie those three things together, you start to come up with a better picture of the things that could happen to me, the things that really matter to me, and my security posture, and then you can start planning what you're going to do about that. I'm going to make it even more complicated now, because I said it was complex. Let's look at how you might start to build that cyber immune system. So I talked about that jigsaw. I talked about understanding the business risk and understanding the cyber risk. At the same time, you've got threat intelligence, which is changing all the time and feeding in. So you've got this sandwich. You've got your business risk and cyber risk at the top, and you've got your threat intelligence, the stuff that's happening externally coming in at you. In the middle there, you can think of that, the processes that you put in place there, as your immune system. And threat intelligence, as I said earlier, isn't just about IOC extraction. It's about the malware deconstruction. It's about the trend analysis. It's about understanding who's attacking, and that's those group researchers. And it's got to feed into a lot of different teams. So where we were seeing earlier, those silos of threat intelligence, if you're just feeding in your IOCs, say, into signatures and into your firewalls and maybe into some of your monitoring, you're missing the consideration of all these other things. You're just looking at such a small part of that picture. Really, you need to be building out. Signatures are fine, they're great. Of course, they're important. But you need to be building out security use cases for those techniques, tactics, and procedures. So saying, this is what the attacker's trying to do. What can I do to detect that activity? That then feeds through into the detection content that you've got. When you've got your detection content constantly feeding into your monitoring, so this isn't a one-time exercise, this is a constant loop. When you've got those security use cases feeding into your detection content and feeding into your monitoring, now you can start pulling out data from your monitoring and saying, how much stuff's hitting me? What's coming through that's not being caught by my security devices? Or what data am I missing so that I'm not able to quickly respond? I'd like a wider view of what's hitting my network and where so I can remediate faster. So then that drives the new security devices that you might want in place and the new data sources. Your threat hunting team, you want your threat intelligence to be feeding into your threat hunting team. You've got your monitoring there, but your monitoring can't always respond quick enough. You want your threat hunters out there looking for things as well and understanding the threats that are there. So they're not just blindly sifting through a shed load of data and hoping they stumble across something. They know what the attackers are up to, and they're searching for it. Your incident response team, feed in your threat intelligence to them so that, again, when they're searching through, when incidents happened, they're able to spot the patterns because they know the attackers' techniques that they're using. Your policies and your architectures, making sure that those are set up correctly so that you're properly responding to your threat intelligence and the business changes that are happening. That's quite a lot of information to go to lots of different people. So, as I said at the beginning, it's not an easy thing, but breaking it up into pieces and saying, well, I'm going to make sure that I deal with this bit of it, and then I'm going to work out how I deal with the pieces over here. You can prioritize for you, depending on your maturity and your skill sets, which bits you're going to look at first. A good place to start, someone asked me last time I talked about this kind of thing, was where does a business start with the very basics? A great place to start is something like CISP, because that starts to give you more than just that picture of just the raw threat intelligence. You're starting to get then what's targeting your particular industry. So that's a good basic first step that can lead you on to better places. So to summarize, what you need to build in your cyber immune system is threat intelligence feeding into your detection content, your monitoring, your security devices, feeding into your response team, so your threat hunters, your analysts that are sitting in the SOC watching the monitoring, feeding into the roadmap of new security devices you might want, new data sources, new defenses, new policies, new architectures, and finally feeding up into your cyber risk related to business risk. And if you just stop at that bottom bit, you are missing such a trick in terms of the defense and the effectiveness of your immune system. So, to summarize, just as the human immune system is good, but it does need looking after, it won't magically defend against everything that's out there. You need to give it a helping hand in terms of the choices you make in your lifestyle, and in terms of the vaccinations that you might want to have, depending on the risky trips you want to go on. So is exactly the same for the cybersecurity version. So as an analogy, the human immune system kind of works all right, but don't stop at the we heal ourselves so your cyber systems will heal themselves if I shove in a few IOCs. Get the latest threat intelligence, do penetration testing, do update your detection content continually and your security posture continually. Do consider the impact of business changes upon what you're trying to do in cyber. Do update your incident response plans, your architectures and your policies. And when it does all go horribly wrong and you need the life support system, be ready to bring in the incident response team who can isolate, investigate and learn from what's happening. The immune system is only as good as the research that goes into it and the defenses that we build. So make sure you get yourself some good cover. Thank you. Are there any questions? Hi. There's a microphone coming your way.
Hello, Martin Hawley from Winsland. I'm really interested in the capability of the threat actors and the attackers, and where does that sort of fit in your threat intelligence scenario? Because you talked about the motivation of attackers, and I just wonder how important that is, rather than their current capability and how their capabilities are evolving.
The capability bit is what I termed as the techniques, tactics and procedures. So in terms, do you mean the capability in terms of the skill sets they have and the number of people they have, or in terms of what they're actually outputting? Let me just check.
I'm thinking skills and I guess number of people, but
yeah. So that is pretty important. You can see it. Adrian's in the audience somewhere. Adrian and Nish's team will look at the code, the malware code, and see how often they're updating and how they're putting it out and how kind of professional it is. And they can see from that how big a team those attackers must have in order to produce the type of malware they have. And that gives you a good clue of who you're up against in terms of the seriousness of it. And, well, it's investment, isn't it? How much investment they're putting in versus what you're putting in defending. But it is important, and we do quite a lot of research on understanding attackers' capabilities. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Adrian, but no. We do. If you want to talk to Adrian about it, he can give you loads and loads, but it is important to understand that.
Thank you for a great speech. How important do you think it is that if you have lots of actors, I work in the banking industry, all doing exactly or mostly what you've suggested, but they're silos, aren't they? They find something interesting on the threat. They can't share it due to regulation. How much do you think we need safe spaces for this to develop? And to use your analogy, the step forward in major vaccine came when there was international collaboration.
It's hugely important, and that's a big part of what SIS was set up to do, was to do that threat intelligence sharing. So, I mean, even at a kind of a personal level, I know I can't operate effectively on my own. I have to bounce ideas off other people and test things out. So I think it's hugely important that we find ways to share what's coming at us, and as much as we can, share how we're defending against it. I know sometimes companies view that as a little bit proprietary, but actually, when we get customers in, we run customer advisory boards, and when we get them in to talk, a lot of what they do actually is compare notes with each other about how they're solving one problem or another problem, and that's on a small scale where we've got people together. So it's hugely valuable to do it, and the more we set up systems and the more we're open about it, the better it'll be.
Hi, Sam Watkins. One of the things that we've become aware of and we're training people about is red team attacks. And as somebody who's supplying a cyber threat analysis tool, one of the things we're looking at is how we cope with those cyber social engineering attacks. They're very hard to spot.
Yep.
I mean, do you think we need to be looking outside of our industries to see what our people are doing?
Do you mean more inventive red team testing?
And defence. We need to be able to predict not just red team testing, but actually how do we predict when our blue team is going to become our red team suddenly because they've been broken?
Yeah. I mean, there is talk about predictive detection. I think it's an excellent concept, and I think there are some technologies that are working towards us being able to do it. I think a lot of them that say they're predictive are not actually predictive. They're very fast, which is different. So, yeah, I think that's why I love working in this industry, because there's loads more that we need to be doing, loads, and thinking about it in new, inventive ways. So, yeah. Thank you. One more, anyone? No? Thank you.
how many of you have work in finance again, just quickly, right? And how many of you have made a payment in the last 24 hours via your mobile phone? Right. How many of you made a payment via internet banking in the last 24 hours? Okay. How many of you used a check in the last year? Okay, right. So today I'm going to really focus on how payments is evolving. Payments is a critical bit of infrastructure across every single business that is in the UK, and I think that it's important that we highlight an important change that is coming through across Europe. So first, let's understand where we've started from. So in 2014, the former Chancellor, George Osborne, released a report letting the ODI investigate how data and finance could be used in a better way. And while he was doing that in Brussels, PSD2 was actually already in planning, and the stakeholder investigations were already starting. And so you might not know what PSD1 is, but PSD1 was the first iteration of PSD2, and PSD stands for Payment Services Derivative and 2, which basically is about the European region making sure that our payment system, we are still in Europe, aren't we? Our payment system is working well, and also allowing organisations to adapt to a certain amount of change. I remember giving a talk in Singapore about the fact that APIs were coming, external APIs were coming into play across financial services and specifically in banking. And a number of bankers in the room kind of looked a bit baffled. Fast forward to 2018, and PSD2 and open banking have all come to life in 2018. And the vision that the Chancellor had at the time has actually started to come to life, but it is taking a lot longer than people thought it would. What is open banking? I am sure that some of you, if you don't work in finance, like, why do I care about open banking? I just want to get my payments done. I just want my business to move forward. Well, the vision initially and the design of open banking and PSD2 was really to make sure that payments were made easier across the European region. This was all before we decided that we didn't want to be within the European Union. However, one thing that we've taken a very pragmatic approach in the UK, and the UK is actually a leader when it comes to how open banking and payment systems should work. So you can sort of imagine it like two train tracks. So what's happening in Europe and what's happening in the UK is very similar, and the industry has been quite practical in trying to make sure that regardless of what happens in the next few months, we are still aligned in order for business priorities to stay the same. One thing that became really important in the design of open banking was actually inviting stakeholders to get involved. But when I sat in meetings and was involved in writing policy documents to feed into what open banking should look like, one major problem with the design was that it was not really full of practitioners. It was more full of lawyers, lots of lawyers, which is great, people that were very concerned about what will happen with security, and also others that wouldn't necessarily be faced with the business challenges of day-to-day. And so if you fast forward to where we are in 2018, a number of UK banks have said that they are compliant with what's going on with open banking. However, not all of them were ready for the January deadline, as most of us in the industry thought would be the case. And a number of our peers around Europe have actually said to the European Commission that they will be delayed in their implementation of open banking. So it's not really going as well as we wanted it to, and being from a startup point of view, it's not going as fast as we wanted it to. I think that when you look at money, people always say, follow the money. And being in the financial services industry, generally we do follow the money. I think that APIs have been used within many industries for a long time, but I think that acquisitions and actual execution in the space show how an industry really is coming to life. So Fedor is a company that was founded in Berlin in 2009, and they were acquired by a French bank called BPCE. Yodely is an American startup that was actually founded in 1999 and acquired by Everest, which is a wealth management company, in 2015. Standard Treasury is from California. They were started by a group of engineers in 2013, and they were acquired by Silicon Valley Bank in 2015. Layer 7 was founded in 2003 and acquired 10 years later by CA Technologies, and Apogee was founded in 2007 and acquired by Google in 2016. I haven't put the amount of money behind these transactions, but it does show that within financial services and within a lot of industries, the use of APIs in order to drive change is becoming more and more important. However, APIs are actually about partnership. And I think that one of the main issues that we have in our industry is that we have quite a siloed approach when we're thinking about how to implement APIs. And I think that it's very important that professionals like yourselves do go and speak to those that are thinking about how open banking, if you are in financial services, is going to impact the business, because it has to externalize APIs is very different to having internal APIs. Banks have been some of the first buyers of technology. Who knows where Bletchley Park is? Right, it's a room full of geeks, which is great. Some of the code-breaking machines that were at Bletchley Park were actually banks were the ones that bought some of them in the first place initially many years ago. And I think that the banking sector does get a lot of slack for not being very good at tech, but actually we're some of the biggest spenders when it comes to financial services. So with this move between open banking and open banking coming to life and external APIs, this really does mean is that third parties are going to be trying to make applications to make your financial life easier. One way to imagine this is if you look at the mobile phone industry. Who remembers when BlackBerries were cool? For some people, they really are cool. That keyboard has had many deals done on it. But we are at a similar place to where the mobile industry were a number of years ago, when people weren't too sure what type of operating system would work well for mobile apps, and people imagined all the different use cases within the mobile ecosystem. I think I remember working with Dell on their mobile program, and I think that's very similar to what will happen when it comes to open banking and how the API economy will move forward. One thing that has been highlighted is that there is a fine balance between the use of usability and design versus the use of security. When it comes to security, you have no idea how secure these third parties are going to be. All third parties have to register with the FCA before they're able to get access to certain customer data. However, we don't know whether or not they have got good security policies, whether or not they have really thought through making sure that the customer's data is safe. And so this is almost kind of where we are at the moment, which doesn't fill the room with confidence. But my message to all of you as security professionals is that it is so important for you to be able to talk cross-functionally and across the business, especially from a business point of view, to your colleagues who may be thinking about what open banking means to their business. We are at a phase where it is still quite experimentational. I travelled to about 15 European cities in the last 18 months, and each country has to implement open banking and PSD2 in a different way. And so that means the local nuances will actually be highly sensitive, but making sure that, yes, we will use two-factor authentication, but making sure that security is designed in the early on part of the process is really important. But it's not always the case. I think that it's very key to make sure that we move away from this spaghetti to some straight lines, because there is a lot of confusion in the market. There are amazing PR and communications people making sure that a number of different vendors say that they do the right level of security when it comes to looking at third parties or implementing your open banking strategy. However, if you have to wait until the end of the conversation when security is thought of, a whole business deal that has been worked on for 12 to 18 months can be unraveled. So when that person from business or from strategy asks you to join that meeting about something new that's coming along the way, I do think it's more and more important that security professionals are involved across the business, because as policies such as open banking come to the forefront of financial services, security will also become more and more important. Nobody likes their money going missing. I'm not sure if any of you have had a payment go missing. How many of you have had a payment go missing and you've had to call your bank and ask them, where is this money? Right. That process is extremely frustrating. Now imagine that process when you've used a third-party app, you've given them permission to your account, and then you go to your bank and say, hi, well, I would really like you to make sure that, to find where this money is. But imagine that third party has not been vetted properly, that third party doesn't have the compliance and security protocols within an organization, because coming from the startup place, there are many third-party providers who don't have the right security in place. And so it is important when your peers and colleagues from across the business do ask for your feedback on whether or not they should implement this new technology solution, or whether or not this third party should be allowed into the open banking app store that almost every bank in the country is creating. I think it is important that you do stay engaged. Everyone has a number of business critical issues that they have to deal with, but in order to move away from this to somewhere down the line where we were, think about where we were with mobile banking, mobile apps 10 years ago, that's almost where we are now when it comes to open banking. It will take a long time to get there, and as a person from tech and startup land, we do want things to move faster, but unfortunately, they won't move as fast if issues such as security are not thought about within the design process. I think that one of the aspects with regards to good design is you being at the table from the forefront. I think yesterday there was the Dixon breach, and what banks and financial services companies don't want is the headlines in 2 years' time when it's Bank X gets hacked through third party, which was on its app store. That I'm sure, like, I'm not a journalist, but I'm sure journalists will make an amazing headline about it. But I think that it is important to think in that preventative way, and also from a business mindset. I know as security professionals, sometimes the business people within an organization are annoying, are naggy, are really commercial, but it is so important from the design of open banking solutions and within financial services that we get your input from day one, and it will be a long process. But having high due diligence, as you do as security professionals, will be really important when it comes to making sure that the open banking industry and community is strong, and that in 10 years' time, we are using amazing financial services applications that solve problems for all of your lives. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for your speech, really interesting. One of the questions I've got is how much appetite do you think the customers have for security?
So I think that security always gets an interesting rap. So when you're at a dinner party and you say, oh, I work in security, most people don't necessarily start jumping in the air and be like, oh my God, what are you doing? Which is their loss, I would say. But I think that there does need to be better storytelling on how great security is important from day one, as we can't be brought in when there's an emergency. We shouldn't let it get to that stage, because there are so many different things that can be done earlier on. Who remembers that amazing NHS hack? Right? Unfortunately, I was in a hospital at that point seeing a relative, and the only way we could get access to his data was through the traditional notes at the side of the bed type way. And most people in the industry know that if NHS professionals had updated a number of patches, as good IT departments do, then a number of things would have changed. But there's also a budgetary issue there, because all updates cost money. So I think that justifying it from a business perspective to the customer is important, but also telling and explaining to the customer why prevention is better than cure, and storytelling in that way is important. And it is hard. It's not an easy thing to do. But it does need to be done and thought of from the beginning, because open banking is actually about a communication exercise as well, because all these third parties will not be able to have any customers if they don't communicate what value they add to the customer's life. I used a check the other day to get a dividend, and some of us still do use old forms of payment because they still work, even though my dad was like, go and get direct debit. And I think that communication exercise is important. So that cross-sector working across companies, so marketing and the security departments working together and taking the time to do that is going to become more and more important.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's really interesting. I think one particular angle I think you introduced towards the end of the talk I think is really interesting is looking at it from a kind of supply chain risk point of view, and that's really been plaguing the industry of late. So, probably one of the most damaging cyber attacks recently was the NotPetya attack, which was facilitated via essentially a backdoor inserted into a patch for accounting software used by anyone who does business in Ukraine. So I'm trying to think this in terms of, okay, well, if someone was able to backdoor a third-party API provider for a bank, I'd be interested in what do you think, what could be the malicious applications of targeting third-party API providers for banks?
I think that one thing that we have to be open to and aware of with regards to when you're using any third party is that it comes with risk. So making sure that from those that are designing the open banking solutions and the app stores that are coming out and the due diligence of those third parties needs to be high from the beginning. So and there is a talent shortage in making sure that this happens. But I do think that it is important to try and do that from day one, and getting the board to understand, because this is a board level, security is a board level conversation. And I think that the business investment needs to be made to make sure that those protocols are put in place in the first place, which is hard to justify because most boards don't want to listen to security unless something goes wrong.
Thank you for your presentation, Adizah. I'm Amy Pinner from WorldPay. My question is that PSD2 come in after we had the hype of GDPR. So we also have PCI DSS. There's so many compliance baselines. What's the discussion around the PSD2 table in terms of creating another new baseline in terms of giving guidance and requirements of what actually need to be met for security requirements for the financial sectors, for the banks, but also for some of the startups?
I think when the European Commission did the first initial call for input, God, I can't remember when it was, but they had received, I think in 2016, they had received so much information that they said that it was the first time that they'd received so much feedback from external stakeholders of how to design a process. So I think that it is important it is much tougher for startups to think about this because they're trying to stay alive, to be frank, because they are startups. And I think that it is important that when you get that invite to join that policy session, that you start accepting them. Because it can't be an afterthought. Because when it is an afterthought, it just makes everything harder. So I would say that taking the time to, over a certain period, to make sure you're involved in that conversation from the beginning is important. But the timetable is hard because a number of countries have said that, hey, we're going to be late with open banking just because we haven't been able to get everything in gear. And PSD2 is ratified into local law across each of the European jurisdictions, which then makes it even harder if you are a bank or a financial services provider that has to adhere to local jurisdictions, which also means adhering to legislation within multiple different languages. And so making sure you do have that pan-European approach of working is important. And other parts of the world are watching what we're doing in Europe. So there are now open banking initiatives in Canada, in Australia, and also parts of Asia. And I do suspect there are a number of Chinese banks that are doing a lot of interesting things in this area, but it's just that we might not hear about them as much here in London.
Hi. Thanks, Adizah. I'm Stephen Edwards from HSBC. I wanted to ask you a bit about your perceptions of open banking from the fintech side, because there is this kind of an argument that open banking is something of a misnomer. It's not really open. I couldn't go home tonight and write a mashup of my banking data like I could with the Google Maps Open API. Instead, I'd have to go through various onerous registration requirements to be authorized to then connect into open banking. What's your perception of that balance between the sort of security and having what is essentially now quite a closed shop of banking, but with slightly more open than it was, versus having a very open system that would allow open connections in the way that we expect with most other providers outside of financial services? What's your sort of view of that?
My point of view is that security and KYC are fundamental when you're dealing with core critical bits of infrastructure, such as payments. I think that, yes, usability, design, etc. are important, but if you don't design with, so KYC is know your customer, and it's something that in financial services, a lot of money has been spent in order to make sure that banks understand their customers. And I think that actually some fintechs and players that have come about over the last few years could take some lessons from at the bigger banks in how to make sure that there is that smooth process. I think that there will need to be a bit of pain at the beginning in order to then have a good set of services. It's almost like when you deliver an app to the Apple App Store, the process that you need to go through in order to do that, to deploy a mobile app, Apple have all these processes in place in order to make sure you as a developer have adhered to certain types of processes. Google and the Android store do have some processes, but there aren't as many processes. And so I would adhere to the Apple point of view of having the pain initially and then being able to have great user experience after. But I am an Apple type person anyway. And also, it is important because at the end of the day, if payments don't get made, it has a huge impact. I can't remember which bank wasn't, I think it was TSB. So TSB had a number of issues and the country just was not happy. So prevention is better than cure. So some fintechs do need to take lessons from our banking colleagues. Thank you.